It was a Friday afternoon when Matthew called. "We're coming up tomorrow," he said, his voice warm but rushed. "Just for the day. Thought we'd bring the boys." I spent the evening preparing. I washed the guest room sheets, fluffed the pillows, and opened the windows so the late spring air could freshen the space. That room had always been theirs, a place for the boys to stay when they visited, a place for family to land. The next morning I made pancakes the way Matthew liked when he was little, and set the table for 4. When they arrived I noticed something. There were no overnight bags. No backpacks for the boys. Emily hugged me quickly and went straight to the kitchen. "We'll head back tonight," she said over her shoulder. "We've got someone using the guest room tomorrow." I frowned. "Someone?" She smiled as if it were nothing. "Oh, we've started renting it out. Just short-term, for a little extra income." I nodded slowly, though something inside me shifted. It wasn't my house they were talking about. But somehow I felt the walls move. That evening after they left, I walked into my own guest room. The bedspread was smooth, the windows closed, the air still. I sat on the edge of the bed and let my hand rest on the quilt. I thought about all the nights Matthew had slept here as a boy, the way he'd leave the curtains open to watch the moon. I thought about the first time the boys stayed here, their small voices calling for water in the middle of the night. And I realized, somewhere between then and now, the room had stopped being ours. A week later, I was on my computer looking for a recipe when I saw it. I had clicked on a local community page by accident, and there it was, a listing for short-term rentals in Matthew and Emily's town. Second from the top was their guest room. I knew it instantly. The quilt was the same pale green the first had helped Emily choose. The nightstand still had the small lamp I'd given them as a housewarming gift. In the photo, a vase of fresh flowers sat in the window. Emily's touch, no doubt. The description read, "Cozy private guest room with plenty of natural light. Perfect for weekend getaways." I stared at the screen longer than I should have. It wasn't the fact that they were renting it. People do that. It was what it meant. That room, in my mind, had always been mine to visit. Mine to enter freely, mine to picture the boys asleep in. Now it was staged for strangers, photographed for people who didn't know the history in its walls. I remembered the last time I'd stayed there. It was 3 years ago, after I'd had minor surgery, and Matthew insisted I come down for a week so they could keep an eye on me. Emily had left fresh towels folded at the foot of the bed, and the boys had brought me breakfast one morning. I'd thought then that the room felt safe. Now it felt gone. I closed the laptop, but the image stayed with me. That night, I went into my own guest room again. I ran my hands over the coverlet, smoothed the pillows, and opened the window. The air that came in was cool, carrying the scent of the lilacs in the garden. I thought about how rooms change meaning, how they hold a certain space for you until they don't. The next morning, I took the extra blanket from the closet and draped it over the chair in the corner. A small gesture, but one that felt like claiming something. Because here in my house, the guest room was still mine to give. It was 2 weeks before I saw them again. Matthew had called in the morning, saying they'd be passing through, on their way to pick up the boys from a camp an hour north of me. I baked a pie, apple the kind George used to make, and put on a fresh pot of coffee. They arrived just after lunch. The boys were quiet, tired from the week away, but they still managed a quick hug before disappearing into the living room with their phones. Emily stayed in the kitchen with me while Matthew brought in a bag of groceries from the car. She put the milk in the refrigerator, then leaned against the counter with a casualness that wasn't casual at all. "So," she said, "we've been getting a lot of bookings for the guest room. People really love it. I've been thinking, maybe we should make it more official. Like, keep it as a rental year-round." I looked up from the pie I was slicing. "Year-round? What about when family visits?" She smiled, tilting her head as if she were explaining something to a child. "Well, you don't come down that often, and when you do, you could always stay at a hotel. There's a nice one right in town." I set the knife down. "I thought that room was for the family." "It was," she said. "But things change." Matthew came in then, carrying 2 mugs. He set them on the counter and gave Emily a quick look, the kind that says maybe not now. But she didn't stop. Besides, she added, this way we're putting the space to good use. You'd understand if you saw how much extra income it brings in. I didn't answer right away. I was looking at her, but my mind was in another time entirely. Years ago, when Matthew was small and we would make up the guest room together before my parents visited. How he would run around smoothing the pillows, so proud to make it nice for Grandma and Grandpa. That room had been a place for us to gather, a sign that family was welcome. And now it was a product. I suppose, I said finally. That's your choice. Emily smiled again, thinking it was the end of the discussion. But Matthew looked at me a little longer before turning away. When they left later that afternoon, I stood at the doorway watching their car pull out of the driveway. The boys didn't look up from their phones. I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table. The pie sat untouched on the counter, the coffee pot still half full. It struck me then, it wasn't just the room they'd taken. It was the place I held in their home. That evening I made up my own guest room, smoothing the sheets and placing a book on the nightstand. There was no one coming to stay, but that didn't matter. The room still meant what it had always meant here. It was a space I kept ready, not for profit, but for welcome. And as I closed the door softly behind me, I felt a small but certain truth settle in my chest. Some spaces should never be rented out. It was late July when I went to their house again. The visit wasn't planned. Matthew had called the night before, saying they had something for me, and I thought it might be easier to drive down than wait for them to come up. The heat was heavy even in the morning. Cicadas buzzed in the trees along their street. As I walked up the path, I noticed the blinds in the guest room window were closed. Emily opened the door, her smile a little too polished. "You made it," she said, stepping aside. "Come in, it's cooler inside." The air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and something floral I couldn't place. In the living room, the boys were sprawled on the couch watching television, barely glancing up. I set the small bag of peaches I'd brought on the kitchen counter. Emily thanked me, then said, "We have someone staying in the guest room just for the weekend. So sorry we can't give you the tour." "I wasn't expecting a tour," I said, but my eyes drifted toward the closed door at the end of the hall. Matthew came in, carrying a manila envelope. "Here," he said, handing it to me. Inside was a sheaf of photographs. Old family prints I hadn't seen in years. "We found these when we were going through some boxes in the basement." I thumbed through them slowly. There was one of Matthew at 8, sitting on my father's lap in this very house. One of George and me at the beach, wind tangling my hair. And one of the guest room years ago before they repainted. The bedspread a pale cream, the curtains patterned with small blue flowers. "That was before you changed it," I said, holding the last photo up. Emily nodded. "We wanted something more neutral for guests. Makes the space feel less personal." "Less personal," I repeated, tasting the words. She didn't seem to hear the way I said it. "Oh, and you should see the reviews we've been getting," she added brightly. "People love the privacy, the location. It's really working out." We had lunch at their dining table. The boys stayed in the living room, still glued to the screen. Emily talked about upcoming bookings, about how they were thinking of investing in a better mattress for guest comfort. At one point I asked, "Do you ever leave it empty? Just in case family comes?" Matthew shifted in his seat. "We can always block off the calendar if we know in advance." "If you know in advance," I echoed. "And if you don't?" He glanced at Emily before answering. "Then, we'll figure something out." I nodded, though I felt the conversation had already figured itself out. When I left later that afternoon, the blinds in the guest room were still drawn. I didn't see the person staying there, but I imagined them. A stranger lying on the bed where my parents had once rested, setting their suitcase down where the boys had left their backpacks after a visit. The drive home was long and hot. I kept thinking about the photographs in the envelope on the passenger seat, about the image of the room before it became neutral. It was never just a room. It had been a place where people I loved belonged without asking. And now it was somewhere you could buy a night in as long as you had the right link and a credit card. When I got home, I put the photographs in the top drawer of my desk. Then I went into my own guest room, opened the curtains wide, and let the light pour in. I pulled fresh sheets from the linen closet, smoothed them over the bed, and placed a single sprig of lavender on the pillow. No one was coming to stay, but the room waited as it always had. Ready, personal, unlisted. And I thought, maybe this is the difference between a house and a home. House earns money. A home earns trust. The more I thought about it, the more I realized the guest room had been changing long before they started renting it. It was a slow change, the kind you almost miss until you wake up one day and see that the colors have shifted. The first time was after Emily's mother came to stay for a week. That was 5 years ago, just after the boys were born. I had driven down to help for a few days, but when I arrived, Emily's mother was already settled in the guest room. Emily had repainted it by then. Pale green walls, beige curtains, a sleeker bed frame. Something fresher, she'd said when I noticed. I told her it looked nice, and it did. But it no longer looked like the room Matthew and I had made up together in his first house, the one we had filled with little signs of family. Framed photographs, a patchwork quilt from my mother, the small desk where Matthew once wrote me a letter on my birthday. By the time I stayed there again, the quilt was gone. So was the desk. The walls were bare except for a single abstract print. I told myself it was just a matter of taste. People redecorate. Life changes. But sitting in that room, with its neutral tones and blank walls, I felt like a guest in a place where I'd once belonged. The next change came when the boys were old enough to have sleepovers. They started choosing their friends' houses instead of mine. The visits became shorter, just a Saturday lunch or a Sunday afternoon. The guest room sat untouched most of the time. Then, one summer, Matthew mentioned casually over the phone that they'd had friends of friends stay for a few nights while passing through. It was nice, he said. We should do that more often. I remember laughing lightly, though I felt something tighten in my chest. The truth is, I'd always thought of that room as a kind of promise, that no matter what happened, there was a place in their lives for me, for family, for people who didn't need to ask. Now I understood that promise had been quietly rewritten. Last night, after I'd put away the photographs from my visit, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and let my mind wander through the years. I thought about the times I'd stayed in that room after George passed, when I couldn't bear the silence of my own house. How Matthew had insisted I come down for a week. How the boys had climbed into bed with me one morning, their small bodies warm and soft beside me. That was the last time I'd felt entirely at home there. It isn't just a room. It's a piece of history. My history. And now strangers sleep in it, their bags on the floor, their shoes under the bed, their hands on the doorknob. I know the world doesn't stop for sentiment. People have bills. People make use of what they have. But this isn't about money, not really. It's about what happens when a space that held love becomes a space that holds transactions. And maybe it's also about me. How easily I assumed my place in their lives was permanent, when in truth it could be moved, repainted, and listed online without my consent. This morning I went into my own guest room again. I opened the window and let the early light fall across the bed. I imagined the boys there someday if they ever asked to visit again. I imagined the way they'd laugh in the morning, the way they'd make the sheets a mess by night. Hope they will. And if they do, I'll be ready. Because here in my home, family will never have to book a night. It happened in early September. Matthew called on a Wednesday evening. His tone brisk, like he was trying to soften something before saying it. "Mom," he began. "I know you were thinking about coming down next weekend. But Emily just realized we have a booking for those dates. It's a couple from out of town, celebrating their anniversary. They booked months ago." I was silent for a moment, holding the phone to my ear. "You mean the guest room is booked?" "Yes," he said, as if that were explanation enough. "I didn't realize you were planning to stay over. We can figure something else out. There's a nice bed and breakfast not far from here." I almost laughed. A bed and breakfast. For years, I'd thought of their home as my place to go when I needed to be close, when I wanted to feel part of their lives. Now I was being offered a stranger's hospitality because strangers were in the room that used to be mine. "I'll just stay home," I said. My voice was calm, but inside something tightened. He hesitated. "Are you sure? We could, maybe rearrange, but it would be awkward to cancel on them now." "I'm sure," I replied. "Enjoy your guests." We hung up not long after. That night, I walked into my own guest room, turned on the lamp, and sat on the bed. I imagined the couple who would be in Matthew's guest room next weekend. Their luggage in the corner, their voices low in the hall. They would leave in the morning, their coffee mugs on the counter, their scent lingering on the sheets. And no one would tell them that the room they slept in had once been the safest place in the world for me. I thought about calling Emily, about telling her how it felt, but I knew her answer. "It's just practical," she would say. "We're using the space." The problem was, they weren't just using the space. They were redefining who had the right to it. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking less about the room and more about the pattern. How many other spaces in their life had I assumed were mine to enter? How many other places in their hearts had been quietly rented out, with new locks and new rules? On Saturday morning, the weekend I was supposed to be there, I went into the garden early. The air was cool, the sky low with the promise of rain. I cut the last of the summer roses and brought them inside, their petals damp in my hands. I placed them in a vase on the table in my guest room. The sight made me unexpectedly emotional, a small act of preservation in a world where my place seemed to be shrinking. In the afternoon, it began to rain. I imagined the couple in Matthew's guest room, listening to the same sound on the roof. I wondered if they felt at home, if they believed that room belonged to them for those 2 nights. Maybe it did. But here in my own house, the rain belonged to me. The flowers, the chair by the window, the bed turned down and waiting, all mine to give or to keep. By Sunday evening, I knew something had shifted. It wasn't just disappointment anymore. It was understanding. Some doors, once closed to you, don't open again. It was late October when I decided to bring the boys their Halloween packages in person. Small bags of candy, a paperback book each, and the knitted scarves I'd made in their school colors. I hadn't called ahead. I thought I'd surprise them. The leaves along their street were brittle underfoot, the air sharp with the smell of chimney smoke. I climbed the steps to their porch and rang the bell. A man I had never seen before opened the door. He was tall, mid-40s maybe, wearing a flannel shirt. "Oh, hi," he said, glancing over his shoulder into the house. "You must be here for Emily and Matt." "Yes," I said slowly. "Are they home?" He stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. "They just ran out to the store. Should be back soon." I hesitated, then crossed the threshold. The living room looked much the same, though a suitcase sat open by the couch. A pair of worn hiking boots rested near the door. "I'm renting the room for a few days," he said, smiling as if to make me comfortable. "Needed a break from the city. Your kids are great hosts." "My kids?" I nodded politely, though something in me stiffened at the phrase. "They told me their mom might stop by," he added. "Didn't expect so soon." I smiled faintly, unsure what to say. It wasn't my home, and yet hearing about myself described in the third person, as if I were a guest, made me feel like I was standing in a place that used to have my name on it. I set the boys' packages on the kitchen counter, noticing that the table was set for one. A mug, a single plate, a folded napkin. We made small talk until Matthew and Emily came in, the sound of their voices filling the hallway before they appeared. "Oh, Mom," Matthew said, surprised but not displeased. "You didn't say you were coming." "I wanted to drop these off," I said, nodding toward the counter. Emily greeted me quickly, then turned to their guest with the warmth of someone who knew exactly why he was there. "Has everything been comfortable?" He assured her it was. I stayed only a few more minutes. The boys came down to hug me, their arms quick around my waist before they darted back upstairs. Matthew walked me to the door. As I stepped outside, I glanced back toward the end of the hall. The guest room door was open, just enough for me to see inside. The bed was made neatly, the pillows fluffed. But the desk in the corner, the one where Matthew had once drawn me pictures when he was small, now held a laptop and a tangle of charging cords. A stranger's sweater hung over the back of the chair. On the drive home, I thought about the way the man had called them your kids, and how quickly I had agreed with the label, even though it left me on the outside. It was the first time I had stood in that room's orbit while it belonged to someone else. And it felt exactly like walking past a closed gate you once had the key to. When I got home, I went straight to my guest room. I sat on the bed, letting my hand rest on the quilt. The room smelled faintly of lavender and clean linen. No suitcase, no boots by the door. It was still mine. Not because I owned it, but because no one could occupy it without my invitation. And maybe that was the difference I'd been feeling all along. The next time Matthew called, it was about Thanksgiving. "We thought we'd do it at our place this year," he said. "Emily's already planning the menu. You can stay the night if you want. We'll just block off the guest room for that weekend." His voice was casual, almost generous, as if he were offering me something special. I hesitated. "You'll block it off?" "Yeah," he said. "I mean, we'll lose a couple of nights of bookings, but it's fine. Family first, right?" It was meant as a kindness, I think, but the word sat wrong with me. Family first. But only if it's penciled in on the calendar. Only if no one else gets there first. "That's thoughtful of you," I said slowly. "But I think I'll just come for the day. I can drive back in the evening." He sounded surprised. "Really? You sure you don't want to stay over?" I could have told him the truth, that I no longer wanted to sleep in a room that had become a commodity, that I didn't like the feeling of borrowing it back from strangers. But instead I said, "I'll be more comfortable in my own bed." There was a pause. "If that's what you want," he said finally. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and looked out at the garden. The leaves had nearly all fallen now, the bare branches of the apple tree dark against the gray sky. I thought about all the times I'd come and gone from their home, the ease with which I'd once slipped into that guest room. I'd never asked, never felt the need to. It had always been understood that it was there for me. Now I realized the understanding was gone. In its place was an arrangement. If I wanted a bed, it would be cleared for me. Temporarily. At a cost to them. I decided then that I would not sleep there again. Not because I was angry, but because I wanted to keep hold of something they no longer seemed to value. The next week, Emily called to ask what I could bring for Thanksgiving dinner. We talked about pies, about cranberry relish, about the boys' latest school project. I said nothing about the room, and neither did she. But after we hung up, I went into my own guest room and stood in the doorway for a long time. The bed was neatly made, the curtains half drawn to let in the soft afternoon light. I imagined someone I loved walking in, setting down their bag, feeling welcome without question. I realized then that this was the line I'd drawn, not one they would see, but one I would keep. They could rent their room to whomever they liked. But I would never again wait for them to make it available to me. That night, I pulled the extra blanket from the closet and laid it across the foot of the bed. It was my way of telling the room, "You are mine to offer, and I will not give you away lightly." Some things once shared too freely cannot be made personal again. It was mid-December, and the first snow of the season had just begun to fall when Matthew called. "Mom," he said, "I know this is last minute, but could you come down tomorrow? Emily's not feeling well, and I've got to take the boys to their school concert. I don't want her here alone." I agreed right away. The weather was turning, but the drive was still manageable. "I'll come in the morning," I said. "Stay with her until you get back." "That'd be great," he said, relief in his voice. "You could just stay the night too, we'll block the room. Might be easier than driving home late." There it was. The offer I had promised myself I wouldn't accept. I almost said yes without thinking. Snow, evening roads, an hour's drive. The practical choice was obvious. But I remembered the last time I slept in that room. The way I'd looked at the walls and felt like an intruder in a space that had once been my own. "Thank you," I said after a pause. "But I'll drive back. I prefer my own bed." He hesitated. "Even if it's late. Even with the snow. I'll manage." The next morning I packed a small bag with soup I'd made, a loaf of bread, and a jar of the peach preserves Emily likes. The snow had stopped, and the roads were clear enough, though lined with soft white banks. When I arrived, the guest room door was open. I glanced in and saw the bed perfectly made, as if it hadn't been slept in for days. Emily was resting on the couch, pale but smiling faintly when she saw me. I spent the afternoon making tea, bringing her extra blankets, and keeping the boys occupied. Matthew returned just before dark, stamping the snow from his boots. "Thanks for being here, Mom," he said. "You're sure you don't want to stay?" "I'm sure," I said. "I'll be fine driving home." Emily tried to persuade me to. "The room's all ready," she said. "You wouldn't be in the way." I smiled gently. "I know. But I'll feel better waking up in my own house." They didn't press further, though Matthew walked me to the car, hands in his coat pockets. "It's not that we don't want you here," he said quietly. "It's just, we have to think about things differently now." "I know," I replied. "And so do I." The drive home was slow, the snow swirling in the headlights, the road empty except for me. I kept thinking about how easy it would have been to accept their offer, to let convenience undo the quiet boundary I'd set. But when I pulled into my driveway and saw the light I'd left on in the front window, I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the heat in the house. Inside, my guest room was waiting, bed turned down, the lavender sachet still faintly fragrant on the pillow. I unpacked nothing, but I sat for a moment on the edge of the bed, letting the stillness surround me. This was the space I chose. The space that asked for nothing except that I keep it. And tonight that felt like enough. It was just after New Year's when Matthew called again. His tone was almost cheerful, as if he'd been saving good news for me. "Mom, Emily and I have been talking," he began. "There's this place opening up in a new community near us. It's for active seniors. Really nice, modern units, lots of activities, even a shuttle into town." I waited, sensing where this was going. "They've got a one-bedroom available next month," he continued. "We thought, maybe you'd want to take a look. You'd have your own space, but you'd be close to us. And you'd never have to worry about guest rooms or scheduling." There it was, the solution neatly wrapped. A new space, away from the quiet friction of theirs, away from the memories embedded in walls they'd rather rent out. "Sounds organized," I said carefully. "It's more than organized," Matthew said, warming to the idea. "It's safe. And you'd have people around, a community. You wouldn't be alone." Alone. That word again, as if it were a condition to be avoided at all costs, as if being with people, any people, was better than being in a space that was truly yours. "Can I think about it?" I asked. "Of course," he said, though I could hear the faint edge of disappointment, like he'd expected me to say yes right away. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table with my tea cooling in front of me. I tried to picture the place he described. Bright hallways, cheerful common rooms, neat little apartments lined up like matching boxes. It wasn't unpleasant, but it wasn't mine. I imagined myself there on a winter evening, the walls painted in the same neutral tones as everyone else's, the furniture arranged to please the eye of a visitor. A place built to be lived in without leaving a trace. I thought about my guest room upstairs, the uneven slant of the floorboards, the curtain that catches on its rod when you draw it, the faint smell of lavender in the pillows. The things that made it imperfect and therefore mine. Later that week, Emily called to follow up. She sent me a link to the community's website, full of smiling faces and open floor plans. "It would give you freedom," she said. "And it would give us peace of mind." Peace of mind. A phrase I'd heard before in other conversations about other things they wanted me to give up. I thanked her for the information, but said I wasn't ready to decide. That night, I walked into my guest room and turned on the lamp. The light fell softly across the bed, across the book I'd left on the nightstand weeks ago. I sat in the chair by the window and listened to the quiet, broken only by the creak of the house settling. Freedom, I thought, is not the same as proximity. And community is not the same as belonging. If I left this house for theirs, or for a place like the one they'd found, I might be surrounded by people, but I'd be further than ever from home. A week passed before I called Matthew back. I'd been carrying the conversation in my head like a small stone in my pocket, aware of it at every turn, weighing it without quite meaning to. When he answered, I didn't waste time. "I've decided," I said. "I'm not moving to that community." He was silent for a moment. "Are you sure, Mom? You didn't even come see it." "I don't need to see it," I replied. "It's not where I want to be." "But—" He stopped himself, then tried again. "I just thought you'd be happier with people around, with less to take care of." "I'm happy with the people I choose, and I'm fine taking care of what's mine," I said gently. There was a pause on the line. I could almost hear him thinking of counter-arguments, lining them up in his mind. But instead he sighed. "If that's how you feel." "That's how I feel," I confirmed. After we hung up, I felt no uncertainty, no lingering what if. The decision had been made long before I'd spoken it aloud. That afternoon I went upstairs to the guest room. Sunlight was slanting in through the curtains, catching the dust motes in its path. The bed was neatly made as always, but it felt like it was waiting for something. I opened the closet and brought out a box I'd kept for years. Inside were the quilt my mother made, a small framed photo of my parents, and the lamp Matthew had once used in his childhood room. One by one I placed them around the guest room, the quilt over the bed, the photo on the nightstand, the lamp in the corner by the chair. The room changed as I worked, becoming more itself, more mine. It wasn't staged for anyone, wasn't trying to be neutral. It was unapologetically personal. When I stepped back, I realized that this was my answer, not just to the community they'd offered, but to everything these past months had been about. I wasn't moving into their idea of ease or safety. I was keeping my own idea of home, and letting it be exactly what I wanted it to be. That evening, I sat in the chair by the window with a cup of tea, looking at the quilt, the photo, the lamp's soft glow. The room felt anchored again, as if it had been pulled back from some slow drift toward becoming just another rentable space. It would never be their guest room. It would never be online. It would never be something strangers could buy a night in. It would be the room I kept ready for the people who truly belonged here. And for as long as I was here, that would be enough. Winter deepened. The snow outside settled in soft layers, muting the world beyond my windows. Inside, the house held its warmth, not just from the heat, but from the kind of stillness that comes when every corner belongs exactly where it is. One morning in late January, I woke before sunrise. The air was cold in the hallway, the kind that makes you pull your robe tighter. I padded softly to the guest room, drawn there without quite knowing why. The first light of the day was just beginning to seep through the curtains. The quilt on the bed caught the pale glow, its stitched squares turning silver at the edges. I sat on the edge of the mattress, my hands resting on the fabric my mother had sewn decades ago. The lamp in the corner stood ready, the photograph on the nightstand smiling at me with the calm, familiar faces of my parents. Everything in the room was exactly where I'd put it weeks ago. Not touched, not moved, not prepared for anyone except in the quiet way of a space that is always ready. I thought about the guest room at Matthew's house, with its revolving door of occupants and its calendar of availability. And I realized I didn't feel resentment anymore. That room was theirs to do with as they wished. But this one was mine. It wasn't about holding on to a space out of stubbornness. It was about what the space represented. The choice to make room for people because you want them, not because they've reserved a slot. I sipped my morning tea in that room, watching the light grow stronger, turning the silver quilt back to its gentle worn colors. The snow outside kept falling, but here, the air felt steady and certain. Later that day, I baked a loaf of bread and set it to cool on the counter. The scent drifted through the house, finding its way upstairs, into the room with the quilt and the photo and the lamp. It was a small thing, but I like to think the room absorbed it, another layer of welcome woven into the air. By evening, the snow had stopped. I turned on the lamp and stood in the doorway, looking in one last time before bed. The light was soft, catching the frame of my parents' photo just so, casting a golden circle on the quilt. I closed the door gently, not to shut the room away, but to keep it, whole, untouched, waiting. There are some rooms you rent out to the world. And there are some rooms you keep for the people you love. This was mine.